So just a few different things that we're going to discuss here about the route exam. And one of the things I really want to make sure that you guys are kind of understanding is, first off, always remember that when you're going through and you're going to be taking these tests, that it is a Cisco test, right? So therefore they are looking for what the Cisco answer is. Like, there are a lot of things, if you start looking into, especially the route exam, of what they show in the class. If I was teaching it, I would tell you some real world examples and how it really works in the real world, right? The idea is, it doesn't matter what I have to say, it has to matter what Cisco has to say in the books, right? That is the correct answer regardless of what the quote unquote real answer is. That's the first thing. I would also tell you, if I was planning on taking any Cisco test for that matter, doesn't really mean anything about the actual route exam, but any test, the CCNA, the troubleshooting test, the switch test, any of the data center classes, doesn't really matter. I think of the idea of how you read the questions and answers is a big deal as well, on what the ease of being able to make an answer is, okay? I rarely go through and read the question and then read all the answers that they have. Right? Think of it the exact opposite way, because one of the problems that I see a lot of people doing is they read the question and they think into it, right? What do I think in my head are the millions of things that could cause this one problem? Where really what you need to be looking into is it's going to be one of those 4 answers down on the bottom, okay? So what I like to do when I take the test is read the answers first. Once I'm done reading those answers, then I go back and read the question. Because now what I'm thinking is, forget about all the millions of things that can cause this issue, right? Which one of these 4 things would cause this issue, okay? I feel that that helps me out quite a bit, just by simply reading the answers first and then looking at the question that we've got available to us, right? So as far as the routing information is concerned, what do we want to really look into? I would tell you a couple different things, and I would say, if I wanted to put them in order as well, right? What do I want to spend the most time on? Obviously, they're going to ask a lot of questions about OSPF, okay? So know OSPF as much as I possibly can. Knowing how to configure it, knowing how it picks what is the best route. If you were here earlier, the idea of all the different LSA types, right? Type 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are asked quite a bit on these tests, right? So knowing those different LSA types and what they are and what they're actually advertising back and forth, right? Where do you want to do things like the idea of summarization? Remember, we can only summarize on an area border router and then on an autonomous system border router in OSPF. Know the commands to do that summarization as well. They're different. On an area border router, you're saying area 1, range, and then what you want for a summary. You're saying, I'm summarizing everything that's in area 1 as it goes outbound to other areas. Versus on an autonomous system border router, where you say IP summary-address and advertise an address range inbound. Right? And that's for all those routes that are being redistributed into OSPF. Okay? So know the difference of what we have to do to set up summarization of both an area border router and an autonomous system border router. Good idea. Okay? I always like to look into the idea of what we use for network statements. Obviously, we can really easily set up OSPF or EiGRP with a real quick, easy, dirty network statement, okay? Network 0.0.0.0 with a 0.0.0.0 wildcard mask, and I can go, or 255.255.255.255 wildcard mask, excuse me, and then I can say area 0. And that puts every interface into area 0 in OSPF. In EiGRP, I can say network 0.0.0.0. And again, that assigns every interface to be a part of EiGRP, regardless of what they have for an IP address. However, I would tell you, as far as the best way to set these routing protocols up is by individual interface information, okay? So one of the things I like to do is to go through and do a show IP interface brief to see all the IP addresses that we have on those different interfaces. And then in OSPF, I would assign each individual address with an all zeros wildcard mask and specify what area we want those interfaces to be a part of. So it's always better to be more granular, if you will, on what interface is going to be in what area. Okay? And I would say that's true in both OSPF and in EiGRP for that matter. Okay? So OSPF would be the first thing that I would really want to spend my time on. I would say then the second thing, obviously, EiGRP. Okay? And knowing really what's the big difference between these routing protocols, right? Where you've got things like the concept of areas within OSPF. You don't have that same concept in EiGRP, right? What do we need to become neighbors back and forth? Right? Those are all good things to know, right? I think of OSPF, we have to have the same hello and indent intervals. We have to be able to say that the link in between the two routers are in the same area. Our authentication type and the authentication password would have to match. And then finally, we'd also have to say this stub area flag has to match for us to become neighbors. Now, you can also add in there, if you really wanted to, the MTU of the link has to be the same between the two routers, or we'll be stuck in the X-start state in OSPF. So important to recognize that. In EiGRP, we got to be a part of the same autonomous system number. We have to use the same K values on how we're determining what is the best path, right? So what are we using to determine our composite metric? Bandwidth and delay by default, or K1 and K3 by default, okay? So again, what do we have to become neighbors? If we have authentication, our authentication type and our authentication password would have to match. So you really got to recognize the things of, can we become neighbors back and forth between the two? Right? What do they use for things like their hello messaging? Right? Where OSPF uses a 224.0.0.5 address, the all OSPF routers. And EiGRP uses a 224.0.0.10 address, okay, that they send all of their updates for in EiGRP. So I definitely know the information about that. Next, I would say then, redistribution. And redistribution, pretty big deal for us. I would think about things like, what do we do when we redistribute between EiGRP and OSPF? What's the difference between the two, okay? Things like when I redistribute into EiGRP, it shows up as an external route, that the administrative distance is automatically set to a 170 on EiGRP. And we can do summarization at any router on any interface in the entire network in EiGRP. Whereas in OSPF, by default, that gets redistributed into OSPF as an OE2 type of route. Okay? It's going to have a cost of 20, and they do not recalculate that cost on a hop-by-hop basis. Remember things like when I redistribute into OSPF, by default, it's only going to advertise class full major subnets. Right? So we have to include the keyword of summary. Whereas in EiGRP, when I'm redistributing into EiGRP, we have to have a seed metric. Their default metric as you redistribute into EiGRP is 4.29 billion and change. It's essentially infinite. It says you can't reach these routes within here. So we must set a seed metric as we redistribute into EiGRP. And remember, even though you're only using bandwidth and delay, we're forced to set all 5 of those metrics, the bandwidth, the delay, the load, reliability, and the MTU. Okay? So definitely need to know what happens when we do redistribution. And how do we solve some problems? Things like, we talk in the route class itself, how do you solve problems like routing loops that could potentially occur? Right? So we're dealing with the idea of making sure that we don't send routes back and forth and create a routing loop. What happens when all of a sudden we see one route that's learned via EiGRP and I dump it into OSPF, and we might see that the OSPF route is the best route at that point. So how do we change things like administrative distance of the different routes that are out there? Okay, I would really look into the idea of not only just changing administrative distance, but selectively changing administrative distance with a distribute list. Okay, going through and say, I want to go through and change the distance to, let's say, 100 for any route that comes from this individual neighbor. Okay, pretty big in there as well. The next thing that I would look into is BGP. Okay, now, I always think when I talk about BGP, you got to remember that this class only goes through a small little bit of BGP and what Border Gateway Protocol does for us. Right? I teach something like 5 or 6 different classes on BGP that are all 5 days long. Right? So it's very tough to go through and teach somebody in about 2 hours anything and everything about BGP. Right? But know things like the values that we have for our different metrics in BGP, how the next hop attribute works, how the autonomous system path attribute works, know how local preference works, the weight attribute works, and how things like our multi-exit discriminator works. You might also want to remember things like autonomous system path prepending. AS path prepending is a pretty big deal for us in BGP. So good questions that they're going to ask for us within BGP. And then from there, again, 4 major topics that you're really looking for. And I would say if you know these 4 topics, you're probably going to be good on the route exam, right, to tell you the truth. Right? Most of that exams are on these 4 topics right over here. But you can also see some other things as well. Right? We want to know things like IPv6 routing. Right? Most of what I would talk about is IPv4, but they do have some questions on there on IPv6. Remember, in most case scenarios, it has no difference whether or not it's IPv4 or IPv6. Right? The idea would be it's more about how the routing protocol works itself. Right? So have an idea of how to configure OSPF specifically for IPv6 versus OSPF v3 that I can use for both IPv4 and IPv6. Likewise in EiGRP, how do we configure EiGRP for just IPv6 versus named EiGRP for both IPv4 and IPv6? Okay? Within BGP, it's multi-protocol BGP, but they discuss in this class the idea of having one single neighbor relationship that you share both v4 and v6 routes in BGP versus having what they call independent transport, a neighbor relationship for IPv4 and a completely separate neighbor relationship for IPv6. What are the benefits of doing it that way? Okay, so they're good things to be looking into on the idea of how these routing protocols work with not just IPv4, but also IPv6. I would spend most of my time on IPv4, but make sure you do not neglect IPv6 on those, okay? So if I had to write them all over again, same order that I'd be looking for, but then within IPv6, okay? Things like v6 redistribution. Don't forget that when you redistribute an IPv6, by default, it does not include directly connected subnets. Right? You have to use the key term, include connected, to make sure that directly connected subnets are redistributed. And that doesn't matter what routing protocol it is. EiGRP, OSPF, doesn't matter. Okay. Some other things that I might potentially look into at this point in time would be like route tagging. In OSPF, okay? They give an example of how we can block things like routing loops when we're doing redistribution on that route exam. Right? And if you look in the route books themselves, they talk about the idea of using the external route tags in OSPF to make sure that we don't cause a routing loop back and forth between different routers. Those would be the things that I really spend my time on as far as going through and looking into the route exam. Now, that's kind of pretty much all I really have for you guys, unless you guys have a question. Does anyone have a question? Let's see if I can bring this guy up here. Oh, hang on. Looks like someone asked me a chat question, so hang on one second. I thought I was going to be late. I'm not really preparing for the Route 330 exam. Just want to grow some backbone knowledge of what's important. What's a better way to use an hour of the day? I completely agree, Steve. But again, the whole idea was that what we were going to do for the exam itself. So great that you get an hour off. That's nice. Anyone else have any other questions on the route exam? And what you might want to be looking into as far as going through and taking that exam. I've heard a lot of people that ask about things that may not be in the actual book. There's only one thing that I know that they will ask. You'll probably see one question on it, would be my guess. It's on EVN, so the easy virtual networking that they support. And the idea that it goes through and automatically sets up things like VRFs that you are using and how to do things like a VRF trunk, an EVN trunk. Now, they're not going to ask you for configuration information, just kind of what is EVN. And it's the use of the idea of having one physical network that's all got IP addressing, and then on top of that physical network, assigning interfaces to be a part of a virtual route forwarder or VRF. Okay, that'd be the only other thing that I've seen that they have on here. And again, you could go through and spend all your time you want to on EVN. There's a lot to it, right? You're probably only going to see one question on there. Okay, so just giving you kind of some ideas of what you might see within there. Some of them are just kind of one-off questions. Okay, well that's pretty much all I have for you. So that's the route exam prep for you. I mean, I can't take the test for you, unfortunately. But I would also make sure, remember, if you guys are planning on taking the test, they're gonna make this an end of life sometime mid-February. So just to let you guys kind of know that there is new classes coming out for the entire CCNP track for routing and switching. So if you're planning on getting it, and I would also tell you this, if you do not think that you can take the route, the switch, and the T-shoot before mid-February, make sure that you at least pass the route and switch. It's the only thing within here that's going to give you any kind of advantage to the new CCNP that's coming out, okay? The idea being is that the route and switch gets you to the core exam that they've got for the CCNP. Okay, so just giving you kind of an idea of what you might want to look into as far as coming into the new CCNP. If you just have the route, it's not enough. If you just have the switch, it's not enough for that core exam. You have to have taken and passed both the route and the switch to be said, hey, yeah, you're good enough as far as that core exam is concerned. And then you just have to go through and do the troubleshooting that you have later on. Now, in my opinion, if you've already taken and passed the route and the switch exam, you might as well take your shot at the T-shoot exam. I thought the T-shoot exam is probably one of the easiest Cisco exams I've ever had. And if you're planning on taking the T-shoot exam, make sure you look up the T-shoot exam topology, because they show you both the IPv4 and the IPv6 topology, layer 3 and layer 2 for that matter. Okay, so give you some pretty good knowledge about what's going on within that test as well. All right, well that's pretty much all I have for you. If you guys don't have any more questions, I'm going to let you guys go. Thanks for showing up.